think, Nicholas, you're the next one, if I'm not completely mistaken. Yeah.
Right.
And we stay with the silence theme.
With acoustic management, sure, yeah. This one is a little different. I feel like in consideration with the general vibe of the grandiose, like really important tasks that everyone is doing, mine feels kind of silly, but I'm very excited to share to share it with everybody nonetheless. Okay, so I think it's working. Everything's good. All right. Hello. My name is Nicolas Eduardo Lozada Martinez. I am also a PhD student from the Digital Media Department at Drexel University. And today I want to talk to you about the general idea of silence and how we utilize it inside of video games for communication. Okay, so first of all, and to make like a small observation, when we're talking about silence, what are we talking about? Well, for it, and to begin with this presentation, I want to showcase a little clip. And now that I realize it, I am not sure if it's gonna have sound. So if it doesn't, please somebody tell me. Okay, let's see if it works.
No sound.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Continue then.
Wait, we should commandeer one of those banshees. We'll need it to reach the pulse generator in time. Good. That point marks our target.
All right. So what I just showcased is a section of the game Halo Combat Evolved. I feel like a lot of people may be already very familiar with it. The importance or the things that I wanted to bring attention here to you is, first of all, the idea that this game is very famous in sound spaces because its composer, Martin O'Donnell, has a very interesting quote talking about the design of the levels having like a I am bored switch, a thing that changed the music from action points until quiet, because it was his belief that music is best utilized in a game to quicken the emotional state of the player, and so it should be used sparingly. So we create these spaces of silence in which the player finds themselves exploring the empty space of the world without music, like epic music to accompany it, really emphasizing the alien space in which you find it. So I feel like that is really interesting. Continuing from that, then what we hear there is cognitive silence. When we hear the difference between the spaces in which sound is being played with music is being present and when it isn't anymore. Cognitive silence we can define as the absence of sound that is subjectively perceived. It is silence that is placed instead of other sounds that could be expected. The silence that follows the dimming of the lights before a concert starts, for example, or the quiet seconds between seeing lightning and hearing thunder. This is silence that brings attention to emotions like anticipation or expectation. It is opposed to non-cognitive silence, which is the opposite of sound. The experience of silence that is So experience of silence is awareness that is not characterized by any qualitative properties. So cognitive silence would be being hearing silence, being non-cognitive silence would be being non-hearing. Make sense? So for the rest of the this space, we're gonna focus on cognitive silence, the idea of silence that you can perceive, noticing that sound is being absent. Continuing for, I want to make the distinction that silence is present and utilized and analyzed in every form of art. We make a distinction between temporal and spatial art, but in both cases, spatial art, of course, being things like painting, sculpture, and architecture, which don't utilize time as part of the processing of the medium. All of them use silence as part of their design decision. It's the way that our museums are structured. Temporal art has a more specific relation to silence. We have silences in music in the way that they vary between tones and spaces for songs to take their shape. For example, if you've ever been listening to a song and you hear the main singer yell "stop" and then everybody stops and then the song continues later on, creating anticipation, that is part of the silences that I'm talking about. They are then in this moment a design position that can be made for a better piece of art. I want to, however, highlight the use of silence in film, and within it, I want to talk about the academic writing made by Whittington that does a bunch of analysis of silence in the spaces of movies. He talks about the vacuum of space, for example, in films like 2001: A Space Odyssey or Star Wars, in which silence has a presence of trying to trigger our imaginations and put us into the space of what these large vistas, larger than mankind, would feel like through the use of silence. He also discusses the evolution of silence in film in the vein of the digital era, since the use of analog equipment wouldn't allow for true silence to be present inside our films. As part of this analysis, we can also explore the uses of silence as a musical or thematical motive, exploring the role of silence as a foreshadowing element that examines the role of a character has in a story. Subsequently, and in a different publication, we had the opportunity to delve into specific sound-related choices. And in speaking about horror movies, Whittington talks about the idea of the long silence, which is the difference between the point of ambient silence that you would expect and then complete silence made by digitally changing the way that the sound is present. That change is similar to the one that we would experience in a danger situation in the middle of a forest. So it is made to try to put us in the position of developing that primal instinct to feel ourselves in danger. And it's very common in horror movies to try to put us in that position in which we feel the expectation for something bad to happen. So taking these things into account, I was led to the idea of talking or creating this research question, which will be, how do video game sound designers use cognitive silence as a tool to communicate with the player? For it, I want to first go through the idea of some basic spaces of communication that are usually used within sound design for player communication. We have things like world building and storytelling that are creatively implanted into the way that our worlds that we explore are, and also the semblances of immersion and realism that are very common inside of the way that we program spaces in our industry. In analysis made by, for example, Nesbitt, we make comparison between different games and notice things like preemptive sounds, reactionary sounds, and feedback sounds being main cornerstones of the way that we sound designers communicate with players. Creating spaces in which we have a bunch of expectations and already information that is by base provided and expected by gamers. Then in that semblance, the idea would be how is silence utilized in this space? Well, looking at the research, the first thing that we can find is the idea of its use in horror games. And from here on out, we're going to talk a little bit about diegesis, which is the difference between the concepts, the sounds that can be heard by the character and by the player. A diegetic sound can be heard by the character and the player at the same time. Silence in horror games exists in a place that exists more or less in the middle. A lot of horror games play with the idea of diegetic silence being present both for the character, but the character not being completely reliable, creating spaces then in which silence passes through that barrier and creates spaces for intermediality. continuing with all of the other semblances applying. Tension and release being present as main cornerstone of the way that horror games happen. A good example for that, or probably the main one, would be the Silent Hill games, in which silence takes a character of its own. The exploration of the town is mostly silent, and the things, the events, and the characters that break through them become the main semblance of interacting with the space. Silence then is a whole section, is the world that we're trying to explore, and then what breaks it is the thing that is unusual. So these are all very well and good, and there are other examples about horror games that we can find about the specific documentation. However, in practice, it is my belief that we can use all of the other things, principles of sound design, inside of the exploration of silence. So we have things like emphasis and style that are really similar to the example that I had already showed you before. In the following examples that I'm going to showcase, they are still going to be present. Silence usually covers the role as part of other information that is also being conveyed, but can only be conveyed the way that it is through the use of silence. So I'm going to go through the other three, which are mechanical conveyance, world building, and character development, to try to talk a little more about the use of silence and the way that silence can have a bigger expression within our context as a sound design tool. So let's start with mechanical conveyance. We're going to look at an example from Valorant.
Grenade! Bomb buddy out. Satchel out. Face your fear!
All right. So in Valorant, a lot of the information, the main information that is trying to be conveyed is sound related. There are footsteps, when abilities are being triggered, where do those abilities fit and are placed, how many bullets are there placing on top of you, what type of bullets are there, and every one of those sounds then is relevant to the experience of playing the game. What the designers at Riot Games decided then was to develop a character whose ability was to try and silence those immediate sounds of feedback, creating spaces in which it was important for players to realize what playing the game without feedback would be. Silence in this context becomes a mechanical tool that players can utilize and try to move around with to try to create a different space for the game. Okay, now let's continue with world building. And for it, we have an example from Hollow Knight. So Hollow Knight is a game that mainly centers around the idea of exploration. In this specific example, we are an intermediate point between one of the tutorial initial sections into one of the main center locations of the map, which is called the City of Tears. In this transition point, the music stops. I'm sorry, I think that I'm gonna sneeze. Okay. In this transition point, we find ourselves without the music, having to focus on the idea of the droplets. The story of the City of Tears is that it is constantly raining because it, as a bog city, is under a gigantic lake that has a bunch of holes, which is the thing that creates the rain. The introduction then to that space is made through the empty area in which erosion has created other droplets to be created. Then the transition point quiets the music and allows the player to have that moment of transition to welcome them into what seems to be a completely new area, while at the same time explaining what the semblance of the area is going to be like. This is important because as you explore the City of Tears, there is nothing that tells you that that is where the rain comes from. That is something that you develop through the idea of the erosion being present, and also while traveling to the lake that it is on top. And it is silence that welcomes the extra information to try to put us in the position to focus on what those things are and why they are important for the world that we're exploring. Finally, I want to make explorations about character development. And for this, we're going to look at a short example from Dark Souls 3. High Lord Wolnir, inside of the story of the game, is a tyrant that conquered a bunch of kingdoms, and then, in the vein of its life, was succumbed into the abyss, leaving behind a bunch of corpses. Dark Souls as a game franchise is very famous because it doesn't have a lot of music, and it's very reliant on the idea of sound effects being the thing that accompanies the player. What makes this section important then is the idea that once you enter the crypt, you are accompanied by the usual silence that you've gone through with the game, and then even the ambient sounds, even the idea of the magnitude of the room gets quiet down the moment that you start entering the actual area of the boss fight and enter the abyss, reading into the transition between what was the crypt, the legacy of the life of Wolnir, and then the result of the decisions that he made. All of them conveyed by the way that the ambience is structured through the taking out of extra frequencies and making an actual, a more reliant, more oppressive silence part of the spectacle of presentation. Okay, so to conclude and to try to start closing these together, I want to make the point that these examples are a few of a lot more that I had prepared initially and that I'm going to finish writing about in the article, but also a lot more that are constantly present inside of the general looking at media and like looking at video games. My point is not that these things are new. The idea is then that the use of silence is fairly common inside of the space, and that it has the same uses or more inside of the interactive medium of video games that we can come back and look at, but we don't. It would be more interesting looking into the future to understand silence as a tool that we can use as sound designers to create better, more immersive, more involved spaces, and think of it as a tool that we can utilize rather than an extra semblance of ideas that is regarded for specifically horror games. With that in mind, I want to leave you with a quote from Akira Yamaoka, composer and designer for Silent Hill, which says that the job of a sound designer is not just to create sounds, so to speak. We also have to know how to use silence. Selecting moments of silence is another way of producing sounds. Here's my bibliography, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Okay, Simone asks, is there a difference between movies and games? And yes, which one? She thinks it would be interesting to compare, which I do agree. That's actually a very interesting question.
Yeah, so there are multiple differences. The main one that we can talk about is the idea that when we are thinking about developing sounds for movies, we are very much in charge of the experience. The idea of putting sounds or silence into very specific spaces is based around the general idea that we have for the final product. We are at the end creating, like we are in control of every frame of space that we have for a show or for a movie. Whilst video game is at the end of the line a very not only interactable a piece of a medium for art, but also we as designers and the people that are trying to do it, we cannot know specifically the way that the player is gonna react to it. So making sounds and creating games in general has to account for the idea that player at the end of the line has control over the experience that they're trying to play, even if that means closing the game and not playing anymore. And those things change fundamentally the way that we can, or we should conceptually think about the way that we produce audio for them.
Okay, I'm relaying the questions.
I also have a question.
Yeah. Sorry, I kind of yeah, lots of questions. How would you think about nuances of silence in sound design as a sound design tool versus a scene that is not well implemented? Do you think it is a matter of taste, or do you consider there are standards to follow? So are there principles?
I think that would be the general point that I'm trying to make, that we can make it into a consideration around the idea of thinking it as a tool that we can try to follow as like thinking of it in the same lines of standards. When we think about a scene not being correctly implementing, that is the difference that I was making at the beginning. That would be non-cognitive sound. It would be something that is outside of the general perception. It would be a thing that is outside of the control. It would be the same if like we were making sounds and the right headphone was broken. I would think that we should think on the same terms that we do, like, you know, noise levels, that we could put parameters around the ideas that we handle these world building spaces, and think about that in the same logic that we think feedback sounds for like interfaces. If we thought it that way, I think that later on, books about sound design could have complete sections about the better ways to utilize sound, and it wouldn't be that hard because we already do it. It would be easy to reference later on.
Okay. I'm going to combine two questions because they're somewhat related. Have you seen examples where silence is also accompanied by something visual? And then the second question is, what do you think is the best use of silence in games? And which game has the best use of silence?
That last one is kind of hard. I think that in general, the main thing that brought it to me was Hollow Knight, because it has several. I like to show my students an example about the way that you can do character development through the progression that a character can have, and the changes that silence has, how it becomes more prevalent to make the character more alone, to feel it, to make it feel its loneliness, which I think is interesting. In relation to the relevance that sound has with visuals, I think that we usually think as sound as visuals as like contrary forces, with visuals usually having like the main say on where things are. My initial like knee-jerk reaction is that silence on its own wouldn't work to communicate as well as it does with the idea of visuals helping it try to convey the rest of the information. Even in the spaces that I gave as specific examples, all of them took advantage of the medium, well, the general experience that was being given to the player, and then through them we gave significance to the silence. But it is a matter of like all elements working together. I cannot give you like a specific thing of like, oh, this is like a good general example, because I feel like all of them are. Following on what Tony had mentioned before, it is half of the game experience, but it's still half of it. It's not all of the whole thing, unless that's the game, which it could be.
Thank you. Arafa had a question.
So as a designer, I know that the sound is important elements, especially in media and creating multimedia designs. And also I know that more than important than sound, silence is more important and would be really strong elements in every designs. I wanted to ask, like, what's your personal experience, and how does it relate to the creation of the content? And how does it impact, I mean, how silence does impact in your designs and in your experience? Because silence can give the time to process the data and information. Silence can can make space to engage with the audience and enhance to create emotional depth. You know, I want to know your personal experience in this.
So I gotta be honest in the sense that like a lot of these, because they fall outside of the general senses, comes back together to something that relates to mixing for like regular mixing, which is the idea that it is a lot easier to try to move from the bottom up, like to assume that you have like a spectrum of things that you can do and then try to fill them in the best way possible. Silence conceptually in this space is a really interesting way for me as a designer of trying to approach sound, because it means it is very like minimalistic if you want to put it in the forefront. It requires you to think about the things that are extremely necessary and then how can you use their absence to try to communicate. But it is also at the end of the line, a very subjective decision. Like it is a design tool, and because it is a design tool, it should be utilized as best you see fit, depending on the product that you're trying to make, which is interesting to me. But it is not. It is like, for example, in the classes that I've given, it is not necessarily something that I'm directly telling all my students that they should use, which is the thing that I would like to change through this investigation. The idea of trying to emphasize it a little more in the general practices of the industry.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all the questions.
So thanks. I think I covered everything. Are there any questions left?
I had a question, but I think you kind of already answered it, so I can just talk with you later about that.
No, if
Okay.
you have questions, just go ahead. We have a minute or two.
Okay, yeah. So in the book Sonic Virtuality, the authors talk about sound as being a virtuality in and of itself. It sort of arises from this void between physical and also psychological components. So in the presence of like the structuralist framework, which I mean, in theory should also extend to silence, because it is a component opposite of sound. In the presence of this framework, what are some of the sort of notable challenges and considerations that you've sort of seen as using silence as a design tool for creating virtual spaces?
I think that the main one relates to one of the questions that was made before, which would be the idea of silence not being used to try to complement the soundscape, but being used to try to avoid placing sound, if that makes sense. In the general space of construction of like what you're saying is the structuralism, we should think of sound as or at least I do, as a means to convey information, even if that information is like just like the requirement, like footsteps make sound, but that is still like a way that you're trying to have a conversation with the player. If we are utilizing silence, then I feel like we have to think it through the means of noticing, like perceiving its absence, which it's counterintuitive to the idea of like not implementing it because it's not there. It is at the end of the line a conscious decision to being placed, which I feel it's the challenge to think of it as something that you consciously have to understand and to place.
For sure. Thank you.
There is one final question that came in, and maybe you can, because we are kind of starting to get close, maybe you can kind of answer with a short answer.
Okay.
How do you consider silence should be approached in nonlinear media like games, where you cannot predict essentially how the soundscapes is evolving as the player moves along?
Okay, to go real quickly, a good example for that is the Halo thing. Make spaces in which after like you play through the event and notice trigger points, moments in which the sequence that you want to apply is no longer there, and then hope for the best. But if not, like a lot depends on the structure of the game and how you're generating sounds and what can be taken away and for what meaning. It is a matter of case by case basis.
Cool, thank you. Thank you, and thanks for all the questions. I think you had a little bit of a fan club there.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine. The next one is AB, and he's going to talk about a topic that I quite frankly didn't know existed.